Here live. It is December 5th, 2014, and kind of a last minute topic, but I thought it'd be really cool to talk about chatops, the idea of sort of like driving your infrastructure and operations through a chatbot, and this idea that came out of GitHub and Hubot, and is definitely one of those sort of DevOpsy sort of practices, tool sets kind of things. So I got a special guest today to talk about that. He actually works on a Ruby-based chatbot that's really cool, named Lita. And yeah, so thank you for joining us, Jimmy.
Thank you very much for having me.
And if you would kind of kick it off, maybe give us a little bit of sort of your background, how you got started with Lita and chatops, and I know you're involved. There's a chatops subreddit and all that kind of cool stuff. So just kind of
share
your story with all that.
Yeah. I've been a programmer for quite a long time. I come from a sort of a computer family. My dad's a programmer, and it's kind of been in my blood. I mostly have worked on sort of application development, full stack web apps, but I've been increasingly interested over the years in sort of infrastructure and the DevOps movement and the bridge between sort of operations and programming. Some of the benefits of programming and software development to sort of the world of the sysadmin. I really like this notion of chatops that GitHub started writing about in, I guess, kind of 2009, 2010 eras when I first started to see things about it. And so they were really sort of the pioneers of this technique, which is sort of the idea of using their group chat room as the interface to a lot of their technical operations. And so they developed this program called Hubot, which they were using internally for a long time. And they were doing a lot of blogging about sort of how it worked and what this did for their company culture. And I was really interested in the idea. I've always been a fan of group chat systems, IRC, and even back in the 90s, I was hanging out on this thing called Hotline, which was like a originally Mac-only sort of integrated chat / file system / sort of news service, and made a lot of friends there and kind of just used it as my just sort of general online hangout. And so I always really enjoyed sort of like the online chat environment as a way to kind of be social, but also be able to multitask and do other things at the same time. And so this idea of using sort of a chat-driven way of running your infrastructure and various parts of your technical operations really I found very appealing. So I think in 2011, GitHub released an open source version of Hubot, which is the one that everyone knows and loves today. And the open source version of Hubot is written in CoffeeScript, and it runs on Node.js. And it's been very popular. It's like this pluggable chatbot framework essentially. So you think of the sort of the original notion of a chatbot was like a program that comes with a bunch of behavior and kind of does something to simulate a person or has some sort of gimmick like that. But Hubot is really more of a framework in a sense, and it doesn't have a whole lot of built-in features, but it's scriptable. So people write their own scripts in CoffeeScript or JavaScript, and they connect it to their group chat service and start using it for essentially whatever they want to. So in 2012, I was working at a company where we were starting to use Hubot, and over the course of a year or so, I was working on various scripts to do some sort of chatopsy stuff for our company. So we had it hooked into our custom continuous integration server, and we're doing some stuff to sort of manage resource sharing among our development environment and staging environments. So a lot of kind of this internal tooling, and it was a really good experience. But the company was a Ruby shop, and everyone there was primarily a Ruby programmer. Not everyone was very well versed in JavaScript, and especially CoffeeScript. was not something that we were using otherwise at the company. And so the barrier for entry and for other people on the team to contribute to the project was kind of higher than I wanted. And there were also a lot of the tools from the Ruby ecosystem that I really missed not being able to use. As much as I enjoy JavaScript and CoffeeScript for projects where they need to be used. It seems kind of this vision I had of being able to do a similar kind of thing in Ruby. So I decided to start working on this project Lita, which I open sourced in I think April, or it was a little later, maybe early summer of 2013. And Lita is essentially it started out essentially as a rough port of Hubot to Ruby. Is basically the same concepts where you have an adapter layer that can allow it to be wired up to any particular chat service, and the scripts, which in Lita lingo are called handlers, which allow you to add new behavior to the bot at runtime and basically do whatever you want. Over time, it's grown a little bit different. I think the two projects have diverged slightly, although they pretty much have the same feature set. They both have data persistence via Redis. They both have support for making HTTP requests in your handlers and scripts, and also have a built-in web server to receive incoming webhooks that can trigger behavior. So essentially, there's pretty much an equivalent of the two. The main difference, besides it being written in Ruby, is probably the use of Redis. In Hubot, Redis is essentially just used for sort of a generic key value store, and it's essentially being used to serialize JSON. So your persistence layer in Hubot is just sort of a big hash of data, and that just gets serialized and stored in Redis. Lita actually chose to expose Redis directly, so each handler gets their own namespaced key in Redis, essentially, or Redis namespace, and you can just use Redis as you normally would without having to worry about trampling on the data from any other handler. So there's a lot of interesting things you can do with the full power of the various features of Redis. So that's sort of one of the main fundamental differences. The other thing that I really wanted to emphasize with Lita was testing. There are some facilities for testing in Hubot, but at least when I was working on it in 2012, it was kind of hard to do sort of TDD and do testing as if you're sort of treating a Hubot script as a more serious program. So I assume that has kind of improved, and it's actually been a while since I worked with Hubot directly. But one of the things I wanted to do with Lita was kind of embrace the Ruby ecosystem's tools and kind of cultural practices. And Ruby has a very strong community of testing and a strong culture of testing. So Lita ships with a bunch of built-in tools for RSpec, the testing framework, that makes it really easy to do tests for your Lita handlers. So you don't have to do a whole bunch of crazy mocking and setting up all sorts of things to kind of wire up the basic sort of request-response cycle of receiving a message and sending a reply to it and checking what the reply was. So there's various facilities for that. There's also a generator for easily creating new scripts and a new adapter if you want to connect it to a new chat service that sort of sets you up with all of this boilerplate without having to know the details of what is required to make a plugin. So I guess that pretty much sets the stage for what Lita is today. And yeah, so we can take it from there.
Well, I have lots of questions. So the first question I have is what chat services do you support right now? And I guess I will preface that by saying, do you support HipChat, Slack, IRC, and XMPP? Yes,
all of those, which are pretty much, I think, the major players today. There's a few that get requested from time to time that I'm hoping will surface soon. Currently, Hubot supports a lot more adapters than Lita does, but I think it's mostly driven by community demand. Obviously, Hubot has a much larger community at this point, and probably always will. But I think also a lot of the adapters are kind of sort of niche use cases, so there isn't kind of the demand for them at this point. So like just based on the fact that those are the ones that you listed that it does have adapters for, that's sort of the core group of ones that are really popular and commonly used.
That makes sense. And I mean, like, what other things would you be using, like Yahoo Messenger?
Yeah, I think there's some pretty archaic ones for, or not archaic, but just kind of niche adapters for Qbot. There's a Skype adapter, which actually I think is pretty useful because a lot of companies do use Skype, and the unfortunate thing about that is that it's closed source. They have no open API, so I think the way it works is actually running it on a Mac and using AppleScript to actually control the UI. If I'm not mistaken, that's how it works.
That's painful.
Yeah, but there are a few other services that I think are going to start to see better support soon. There's a service called Gitter, which is a web-based chat that is coupled very tightly to GitHub, and the idea is to essentially add a chat room to any open source project. So I'm a big fan of sort of their goals. I really like the idea of having collaboration around open source easier. So I just recently started working on a Gitter adapter to hopefully help drive some adoption for them. And so that's in progress. I don't know when it'll be finished. Another one I've seen requested a couple of times is FlowDoc, and I haven't used that myself, but I think my impression is that it was starting to get popular around the time that Slack came onto the scene, and for one reason or another, Slack seems to have really taken off and sort of gotten the public mind share. So, I'd like to support anything that anyone's using, and of course that's the design of both Qbot and Lita, to be able to adapt it to any service that you might want. There is also one sort of niche adapter for Lita, which is a Twitter adapter, and Qbot also has a Twitter adapter. So I'm actually curious, like, what people are using that for. Seems a little bit sort of. I mean, it's certainly not like the standard working on a team at a technology company controlling your infrastructure through it. But I think some people are using it for kind of interesting personal uses. Like I know there's a guy that is in Japan that uses Lita for home automation. So he has it connected to some sort of something like Arduino or some sort of equipment in his house that does things like controlling the lights and the temperature. So that kind of thing maybe would make more sense to be able to tweet or send a direct message to a Twitter account to control that. I'm not really sure what the use case is. Definitely kind of interesting.
It's like an ebooks account.
Yeah, exactly.
That's insane.
I like to see a horse ebooks derivative powered by a chatbot.
Sit and have a conversation with it.
Yes, exactly, and it'll just respond with nonsense that you couldn't have dreamed up.
So I guess being an ops person, my first question is like beyond does it support the thing? Okay, I'm interested. Now, how do I go turn it on? Like,
right.
We run so at Chef we have HipChat. If I wanted to go set up Lita as a HipChat bot, what would I do?
So you just need a place to deploy it, really, and it's a simple Ruby gem. So in Chef's case, that's very easy because you're already essentially a Ruby shop, and you have the infrastructure around deploying Ruby applications. For teams or people that are not so familiar with Ruby, well, first of all, they may not actually be interested in using Lita off the bat, because the whole idea is that it's scriptable for Ruby programmers. However, the barrier to entry is fairly low considering that. The doc site has complete instructions about the various ways you can install it, but essentially all you need is a Ruby runtime and a Redis installation, and you can configure Lita to talk to Redis if it's on a remote server or behind any like a proxy or any sort of special configuration. But basically, you're just talking about installing a gem and running it in either in backgrounded essentially as a daemon.
So how do you spell Lita?
Lita. So the website is lita.io, which consists mostly of just documentation at this point. So there's a couple of there's two sections of guides. One that's getting started, which is essentially how to use the framework as someone running a Lita chatbot, and then there's a plugin authoring guide that has all the details about how to write your own scripts.
So apparently, just jumping in really fast because I was curious, there's actually a cookbook on Supermarket to stand it up. Now I'm curious if there's one on the Forge.
Yes, I believe so. Oh, actually, I'm not sure about the Forge, but yeah, there's this fellow named Harlan who started using Lita, I guess, maybe 3-4 months ago, and was talked about wanting to set up a chef cookbook to get this configured on his infrastructure. So I just created a new repository for him on the Lita IDO GitHub organization and gave him access to it and said, have at it. And he really took to the cause. I'm not sure where this guy came from, but he's like my chef superhero. So if he's listening, I want to thank him for the work that he's put in helping people manage Lita through Chef.
I now feel like I should go play with it just because there's a cookbook for it. It's amazing how much easier that makes, because like I'm willing to bet now I'm even more curious as to whether or not there's a test kitchen thing. But well, okay, so then the next question becomes, and this is something that's really irked me a little bit about like chatbots. Historically, they're a single point of failure.
Mm-hmm.
Like, even Hubot, I've never seen Hubot run in a HA fashion, if you will. And in some ways, it's almost impossible for it to be run in an HA fashion because it's a listener, and you can only have one instance of it listening.
Right.
I mean, I guess in concept, if you were crazy, you could, and had like Zookeeper infrastructure, you could like monitor it and do something like that. But like, how does that? Have you put any thought into what the HA story becomes, or like that problem set at all?
Yes, I think if it needed to be replicated in some way so that you're essentially clustering it across multiple processes or multiple machines, I think the big trouble that both Hubot and Lita are going to have is that they're both backed by Redis, which does not have a good story concerning multi-process or multi-server installations. I know that Redis in particular is kind of the bane of a lot of ops people's existence. A lot of people that I know have a lot of trouble with it, and just kind of constant latency spikes and when trying to run it in a sort of a highly available way. So from that point, I think there is sort of a fundamental design flaw in sort of the coupling of these backends. Actually, in the case of Hubot, the Redis backend is actually not it's not required. It's actually sort of a pluggable backend system. I think pretty much everyone uses it with Redis. That's kind of like the default, and that's sort of the way that it's been documented to be used. But Hubot is actually at an advantage in this case because it uses Redis essentially just to serialize JSON into a single key. And so that means that you could essentially put that anywhere. So you could put it in Riak, for example, which has a much better story about availability across clusters. I think Lita will be in more trouble if it gets into a situation where it needs to be scaled in that way. I think that, so I've thought a little bit about how the backend might be kind of made more generic, or certainly the Redis backend might be made optional or something if you happen to be using it in such a way that you don't need it. Maybe all of your plugins, want to use another data store manually and not use sort of the provided API. So that's certainly a possibility. But more than anything, I'm trying to keep the work that's being done on Lita at this point be really driven by use cases from the community. And so I'm kind of curious as to what the reasons to need to run something, as ostensibly simple as this at a scale like that. I mean, presumably you can only have sort of a certain number of people in your group chat that are all operating the same bot before it kind of becomes unwieldy for the people in the room to manage what's going on. So I'm kind of curious of like what performance concerns will actually crop up that might drive the use case of needing to do something like that.
Well, and for me, it's more the okay. Well, the lead, and we've seen this at Chef on occasion, where because of the nature of these bots, the bot dies. You
Hmm.
know, forget Redis for a second. You know, it threw an exception for whatever reason. It's dead now,
Right.
um, and didn't come back up because there's only one of them.
Right.
Um, and I guess, well, and so at that point, that question of okay, so it died and it needs to come back up, like if that's how you control your infrastructure, you're kind of like there's
I
this
see.
that chicken and egg problem, right? Like in concept, you have a chat bot that you connect to restart the chat bot. Like I mean,
Hmm.
you can take this to ridiculous levels, but you
Right.
know, if you're getting DDoSed and your DDoS mitigation is in your chatbot and your chatbot falls over for whatever reason,
Hmm.
um, you know, how do you recover the chatbot? And I
Yeah.
guess the simple answer becomes, well, you just have the single instance and you use something like run it to restart it,
Right.
and you know, add additional monitoring, something that'll kick it if it stops responding or something.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you want to have some sort of process monitoring in place to keep it running as a daemon, even if it crashes for some reason.
Mhm.
And this is I can the sort of my only personal experience with this so far is that I run a few instances of Lita for various purposes. The one that probably gets used the most often is just the one that my friends and I use in our own IRC channel for fun.
Mhm.
And it runs on Heroku, which is on a free dyno. So occasionally, even though it's being pinged by an alert service to kind of keep the free dyno from idling,
Mhm.
occasionally that ping doesn't happen or something, and so the dyno goes to sleep, and that causes it to shut off. So we just have in the topic like a link to the HTTP route for like the basic sort of info page that will wake it back up and then it reconnects.
Mhm.
Occasionally, it gets to the point where I have to restart it from the command line for some reason. So that's pretty rare, though. Usually, the only reason I'm restarting it is just because something changed in the configuration or something like that. But generally, usually just waking up the dyno. I haven't seen it crash for a reason other than that. So that's certainly not a guarantee. Like you can't just say, "Oh yeah, the program is so good that it doesn't crash, therefore you don't need to, have a failover scenario." That's certainly not reasonable. But in practice, so far, that hasn't been a driving concern from anyone I've heard about. I do like the idea now that you bring it up of, if the concern is just having redundancy at the chatbot layer itself and not the data persistence,
Mhm.
then that actually makes it easier. That's an easier problem to solve, I think, because multiple instances of the Lita process can all be talking to the same Redis instance, as long as you make sure to run atomic operations on the data store, and then you can have some sort of routing layer above that actually sends it to a different process. Of course, then you still do have your chicken and egg scenario of you're not talking about a website where where you have DNS to kind of round robin requests to the load balancer. When you're talking about connecting to a chat service, like there needs to be some ultimately single point of connection between the chat service and whatever the load balancer is. So I think it might turn into the same sort of chicken and egg problem where ultimately you're going to need a single process somewhere to be connected to
Mhm.
chat. So we'll see. I have to see how that evolves as the need arises.
I just had this horrible idea of taking the fact that Lambda allows you to run things in a cron way and
Hmm.
using it to be the thing that pings your Heroku dyno to keep
Uh-huh.
the chatbot running.
Yeah.
That's
Um,
horrible, but that's kind of awesome.
yeah, there are various services that you can use to just ping the dyno. I think actually Hubot has a facility that basically makes it ping itself. At least the open source version has it's intended to be deployed to Heroku, so it has this sort of feature built in that if you supply a URL to the app where it's actually being hosted, then it'll send its own HTTP request to itself. And yeah, Josh has just put into the chat a link to a script that will automatically do keep alive. There's nothing currently built into Lita to do that because I don't really want it to be tied to, at least not in the core, I don't want it to be tied to a particular deployment mechanism. So for my own installations, I use Uptime Robot, which is a free service for essentially basic uptime monitoring for, I think, up to 50 sites. So for personal use and small businesses, that's actually pretty much all you need. And I've had very good luck with it.
So, Josh, am I reading this right? You are a core contributor to Hubot?
That's right.
That's kind of cool.
Actually, the way I found out about this is we have a Hubot script for Twitter subscriptions. In a room, you can subscribe to tweets. So there's one for Hubot, for chatops. And so in my Hubot lab, I saw this. So.
That is awesome. That's kind of neat. Now I've got crazy thoughts going through my head of running something to like follow tweet streams and like auto respond with, "Hey, go do this thing," or whatnot. So.
Yeah, we for the offsite GitHub, we actually have one for around like searching for GitHub and Unicorn and GitHub and errors and things like that. So it's like kind of a way of monitoring things like that in case like our other monitoring this is stuff.
That's cool.
Definitely useful in a lot of places.
Yeah, I've been kind of pondering doing something with IRC where, like, when people mention supermarket, to let us know in HipChat that someone just said something about supermarket in Pound Chef. You should probably go over there.
Yeah. I also have a few Twitter streams that are following a few chatops related terms. So I'm looking at pretty much all tweets that mention Hubot or Lita and chatops. It's much easier to follow Hubot because, as it turns out, that's a almost unique term to the tool. I think Hubot is actually a word in some other language. I can't remember which one. So occasionally it comes up being used in some context that's not related to the bot. With Lita, it's unfortunately much harder to filter for that because Lita is the name of a professional wrestler or a former professional wrestler. And I think there's also a brand of shoes that are called Litas. And seems to be a lot of people on Twitter who have Lita in their username or know someone named Lita who they're mentioning. So the query that I use on Twitter to actually follow it is kind of convoluted at this point. I'm sure I probably don't catch all of them. But I guess that's my own fault for not picking a name that was completely unique.
On a positive note, you don't regularly get made hungry because of pictures that are tweeted at your corporate Twitter handle.
Yes, that's true.
So, I wonder sometimes how many people, like, I've looked at chatops and it looks amazing, but there's the number of people there's that pushback, right, of, well, I need to go on the box to actually know what to do with it. Do you guys hear those types of concerns about chatops, or is it something like, I would imagine GitHub is a decently sized fleet that you're at a point where logging into boxes is kind of an anti-pattern. But I wonder if, as we discuss chatops, what the pushback is. Like, why wouldn't you do chatops?
For in my experience, the big drawback is it's not even really a drawback, but it's more sort of just selling the idea in the first place, because it's something that's maybe not obvious, and it's something where you can't really see the benefits of the effects on a team's culture until you start using it a little bit. So for me, it's kind of, it's been motivated by reading GitHub's writing about it, and then blog posts from other people who started to use it and started to see sort of the benefits of the pattern. But it's not something that people are really clamoring for at this point, I think. It's just kind of something. It's still sort of a concept that needs to be sold, and so I think like the people at GitHub who have been writing about it and everyone who's kind of trying to evangelize it are trying to kind of spread the word about, like, here's this practice that we're using that's been really helpful, and you should try it. So I think that's part of it, is just sort of a barrier to adoption. The other one, as the only type of direct pushback that I've really heard so far, when you're essentially proposing this and people are saying, well, maybe that's not such a good idea, is stuff around authentication and security. which I think is kind of a big issue. For one company I worked at, we did have a chatbot, but they didn't want to use it for any of the sort of technical operations that most of the interesting use cases for these chatbots are. So things like using the chatbot to deploy and using it to monitor infrastructure, essentially anything that has any sort of privileged access that might want to be audited. There was an argument that, for example, if you're starting a Jenkins job to kick off, deploy or a build or something like that, if you are sending the request to Jenkins via a chatbot and it's coming from essentially a single account, then you lose the information of which user actually triggered the build. You don't necessarily lose it, but it's not completely trivial to sort of keep that audit trail. So where you have a user who's directly logged into Jenkins, starting a build, and now you have a record of who started that build, seeing that as opposed to build started by Hubot, build started by Hubot, build started by Hubot, and needing to have this sort of custom system to assign attribution to who did what.
That almost seems like backwards, right? Because like I've heard that argument, and then I thought about it a little bit, and it's like, okay, so what you're saying is that the public chat history that no one has the ability to change is not enough to, from an auditing perspective, because in reality, in many cases, you end up with more of a history of what's going on, like
context.
Yeah, like, well, not only context, but like that thought process of, someone restarted MySQL on the master, and that was bad. We should go talk to them and make sure that they understand that that's not a thing they should do. But they did it from, it came in as root from the Bastion host that we use to actually do all these things. So we actually don't have any clue as to who did it because they were logged in as root when they did it.
Right.
Like, I mean, not gonna lie, I'm still guilty of, like, I jump onto a box and what's the first thing I do? Sudo space dash I. Like, it's, and back when it was Solaris, it was just sudo space dash, or later it was KSU, space dash, and I became root. Like, I feel like that argument is one of those arguments of, oh my God, something scary. I'm going to come up with the authentication. That works. That's an excuse.
Yeah, to some extent. But I think whether or not it's a sort of a valid perspective, from the purposes of getting these tools adopted, you have to be realistic about how people are going to respond. So if that is a way that people respond, then there needs to be a way that we address those concerns. And so, I mean, we can sort of make that counter argument, but just to answer your original question, like, that's the kind of thing that gets pushed back about why would you maybe not be hesitant about trying this out, or not even consider it in the first place. There's also the case that for a lot of companies there isn't, they don't have a permanent history of their chat. Ironically, also for auditing purposes, they intentionally turn off a chat history past a certain point, because if you have 5 years of company history and then something happens where you actually, it's it's sort of a liability in addition to a protection for yourself, because there's a lot of things that happen in chat. So given that, you do actually lose some level of auditing unless you're doing something explicitly to track that auditing or track those operations that people have taken in some sort of external resource that's shared or that's persisted for longer. So it's not a trivial thing. Like, it does introduce a little overhead and complexity that you wouldn't have otherwise with your current systems. So it's really just becomes about balancing the benefit versus the risk, I think.
So what kind of sort of ACL authorization features exist in Lita in this case around limiting like what commands can be run?
Well, Hubot and Lita have the same basic mechanism for authorization, which is a concept of authorization groups. So you can specify in the configuration, which is static, which of the users are considered sort of master administrators, and those administrators have access or have the ability to. Actually, I'm not sure if this is the case in Hubot, but it's definitely the case in Lita that only the master administrator is able to create authorization groups, which are essentially just arbitrarily named strings. And then you can add and remove users in the room from an authorization group. And you can have the syntax for routing in Lita allows you to restrict a particular chat route to only users that are in a certain authorization group. So if someone who's not in a group sends some sort of dangerous command, then the bot doesn't even send it to the handler to trigger that action. So there's no sort of manual check if this person's allowed to do it. It's sort of built into the routing layer. So the downside of that currently is that you can't really customize which actions within a script you want to be blocked by a certain authorization group or filtered. So it's essentially up to the author of the plugin to provide that ability. So that's sort of maybe a small hindrance to adoption for an open source plugin. Like maybe there's something that the plugin author thinks is not particularly dangerous, so they don't provide filtering at the authorization filtering for their scripts. But the person using it thinks, I actually do want to kind of authorize this. Currently, the only way to do that is to actually write your own handler that wraps the other one, which is not a super trivial thing to do. So I'd like to have in the future some sort of better features for a user to be able to specify custom access controls for a script written by someone else. But for the time being, I think the use cases are generally pretty simple. So anything that has potentially destructive operations tends to get written in a way where there's some sort of administration or authorization group that's associated with it. Like for the plugins that I've written, DigitalOcean is an example that essentially lets you control all of your DigitalOcean resources through the chat room. And in order to use any of the DO commands, you have to be in an authorization group called DigitalOcean admins. And so it just filters it at the global level, essentially, for the entire handler, which is probably not the ideal amount of granularity, but that's kind of work that needs to be done in the future to improve that.
Can you have multiple instances of handlers based on the room? So, like, I have this thought process of, like, let's say you've got an AWS handler, but you've got a release engineering team, you've got a development team, and you've got an operations team, and they're all using different AWS accounts. They all have different sets of privileges as to who's allowed to do what. So, like, in the operations room, everybody should be able to join the ops room because we want to be able to, let ops know what's going on, or vice versa. But only inside the ops room should you be able to give commands to the production environment, and you must be an operations, be authorized on the operations team as well. Does that make sense?
Yes. So that is possible. The way you do it currently is kind of just a manual check. So inside a callback for any of the chat routes, you get access to this response object that has details about it's essentially the primary interface of the chat sort of request-response cycle. So it has attached to it information about the incoming message, including who the user who sent it was and the room that it came from. So if you have a particular set of rooms that you want to allow access to a route only for that room, then you can do a conditional check in the callback saying, am I from one of these rooms? And if not, just return without doing anything. There isn't anything built into the routing layer to do that in the same way that authorization works, where it doesn't even trigger the callback. But it's effectively doing the same thing either way. It's just a single conditional that short circuits the whole operation.
That makes sense.
Of course, that could also be configurable, so you don't need to hard code like the IDs of the rooms where you want to do this. Like you can put it into a configuration option for the handler that can be set via the runtime configuration for the bot.
Okay, cool.
So it can be abstracted a little.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm giving very specific use cases where, like, I know it's something possible, but I don't know that anybody's doing it. I mean, the other question is as well, at some point with these types of teams, it almost makes more sense to just have RelEng run their own Hubot, or have the dev team run a Lita instance, for whatever that team needs,
right,
etc. But in some ways, it's also nice to have like one bot to rule them all.
Yeah, that's true. I think there's been a few people that have asked about the idea of sharing a single Lita instance across multiple chat services. This is a topic that's come up a couple of times. Like they want to essentially have the exact same handler configuration and naming scheme and authorization groups, and they want to connect the same instance to both IRC and TipChat, or IRC and Slack, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a little more difficult than just running two separate instances, because you're talking about sharing. You would essentially need a way to map users between the two services to know that Joe Smith on one service is the same Joe Smith on the other service, because the authorization layer or the user data doesn't currently take into account the idea of multiple adapters.
You'd have to be careful, like in HipChat, where username X, and then is an authorized user, but in IRC that they're not authorized. So if someone and you can even see games where I guess if you check right Indy, but anyway, that idea of you could do some crazy stuff in that realm.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting idea. There's been very early on, there was a guy that was working on some Lita stuff that had a proposal for actually adding sort of multi adapter support. We talked about it a bunch, and kind of the consensus was that I think that the use case for it was a little too marginal to justify the complexity of adding that feature to the system at that point, especially since there were sort of a lot of unknowns with what kind of problems it would actually create with potential data races and kind of confusion of mutable state. So we kind of opted to not do that and just say it's sort of an anti-pattern almost. Like we want to encourage people to run separate instances and find some other mechanism for communication if they want to share data between two instances.
Well, could you, in concept, just have the two instances share the same backend Redis instance and just use a different handler?
Yeah, that's sort of what the proposal was about. And so I think the main reason that was a problem is sort of the user mapping and the fact that at least currently the way the data is modeled, like there's only one user namespace in Redis, so it's not keeping track of users on a per adapter basis. And so that could be changed to keep it in a separate place. But at that point, what advantage are you really getting over just splitting it apart? I guess essentially just some of the handler-specific data, essentially. So like the specific use case that was brought up early on was sharing Karma across two different instances. Karma is like the little plugin that lets you upvote and downvote terms by doing plus or minus after them, and it just keeps track of like a point count for each term. And so they wanted to be able to use these two services, but have an upvote for one term appear in the other service. And so that seems kind of simple in theory, but there's a lot of assumptions that are made by the data model that kind of make that difficult.
Makes sense. Funny how those little things work with computers, where
yes,
it's more complicated than you expected.
Totally. But I think that's also why it's important to try to drive features by use case, because you want to essentially, it's just sort of like in the agile methodology, you want to kind of defer decisions until the latest possible time when you have the most possible information. So I try not to do too much sort of architecture astronauting and design up front, because I may not be considering a real use case that I might be blocking out for the future.
I never understood how big of a deal that was until I got involved with Supermarket, and it's like, oh, let's just start with the smallest possible implementation of this feature.
Right.
Oh, people use that way differently than we expected. So that thing that we were going to do, yeah, we're not going to do that anymore. Or, oh, we absolutely need that additional thing. Let's go ahead and add it.
Yep.
So a question for both of you, both Josh and Jimmy. If you're, so I'm an ops person. I went and stood up Lita or Hubot. What is my best way to start getting tasks into that the bots can start doing in my infrastructure? And then I've got some thoughts, and I'm curious about that. But what would you say is the best way to start automating my infrastructure? If I've already got something like Rundeck or Jenkins in place, is probably also useful to know.
Right. So there's essentially two ways that you can do it. One is by using infrastructure services that are hosted in the cloud that have their own API. So if we're talking about something like AWS or DigitalOcean, you can have a Hubot script or a Lita handler that essentially exposes that API, and you can have these sort of manual commands around them that you can use from chat, and that doesn't require you to have your own server where these commands are actually being executed under the hood. And then, of course, there's something like Rundeck that kind of is a cloud version of allowing you to do these sort of arbitrary tasks like that, which is very useful. Of course, there's also, if you're just building things for internal use and you're not planning to open source it, there's no real reason why you can't even do something as simple as shelling out from a Lita handler and executing something on the file system of the server it's running on. So in a very simple sort of small-scale use case, even something as simple as that would be possible. Like essentially, like for deployment, imagine having a Capistrano installation or ready to go on the same host that the bot is running on. I probably wouldn't recommend that, but as just like a super small sort of barrier to entry, that's possible. Josh can probably talk more about how it works at GitHub. I know for deployment they have their own system of using this Heaven app to trigger deployments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean for if I were to think about like implementing chatops from scratch, I've actually been thinking about like kind of a blog post or talk that's called like chatops from scorched earth. Like, what if all the chatops disappeared from GitHub? How would I rebuild that? And like I think like I did implement chatops on my last job before coming to GitHub, so I had some experience there, and I think the very first pass I usually do is like trying to determine tasks that involve me knowing a website or a URL somewhere to go to click on something to find out a thing, and it's like that's not very shareable. So it's like, how can I get that in chat easily? So I think one of my stupidest but useful scripts was like, I think a Puppet reference, because I can never remember the URL for Puppet type references. So like, and it's well-formed URL that has a hashtag at the end. So I just like give me like Puppet type for file, and it just like drops in a link. And it's like a very like easy thing to do, and it's not scary either because it's not actually doing anything destructive. So that's usually like my first path. Or just like remembering, like basically using it as a glorified bookmark service is pretty useful. Like I have one for Nagios 4 documentation because I can never find the URL Googling it. And then from there, like you can kind of look at the tools that you have and like what you want to do and like what involves you going out to a place and typing some stuff and doing a screenshot or something, and slowly building tools that are doing like shelling out to something else. Like for Hubot, we have like a framework for calling out to Ruby basically. To be able to just use mechanize, shell to different things to just like pull data out and then put it back. So like I think a good example, like pulling up tweets or pulling up like Nagios status would be a good one. And just like getting that data into chat, like that's still like kind of read only. And then from there you can start being like, okay, what else do I want to do? And that's where you start like implementing APIs and either consuming internal APIs or like already off-the-shelf ones, or writing your own to wrap either of those to kind of give you a simpler interface to interact with from Hubot or Lita or whatever.
Interesting. Okay. like I had this like initial thought of, I almost want to play with like easy interfaces to things like Rundeck, where like I can imagine handing to some of the shops that I've worked at where the idea of them writing code, even though they do it every day because they write Perl and Shell, like that sounds scary to them. So if I could just create something simple that listed all the Rundeck jobs, because that's a web interface and that's not scary, listed all the Rundeck jobs, and you could from chat execute Rundeck jobs. That seems like a way to start. But I love that Puppet reference is perfect, because I used to do that all the time. Like I always, when I've talked with people, it's like, yeah, no, I've memorized exactly how to, I can do the clicking in my sleep because I know exactly how to get to it, because I could never remember that crap. Like, so, and I'm getting there with Chef as well. So like I feel like I'm going to hit up our internal person and be like, hey, we should write a script that does this.
I have two comments on these topics. One is that there actually is a Rundeck handler for Lita that was developed by the same guy that did the Chef Cookbook. So I haven't used it myself yet, but I think it's essentially what you're describing, like being able to list the jobs that are available and execute them. The other thing is I think it's actually really important what Josh was saying about using it for something as simple as a bookmark. Because most of the writing that we've seen done that's sort of talking about the benefits of doing this has all been about sort of automation of technical sort of sysadmin type stuff. So a lot of the main examples are deploying or spitting out performance graphs from Graphite or something like that, monitoring kind of stuff. But I think it's also really important to think about the sort of non-technical aspects of what this can do. There's really no reason why there can't be scripts to support the sort of workflows of non-technical people. And so bookmarking is a really good example, and that's something that we also use with Lita. There's a really straightforward handler called key value that's just essentially, here's a key, here's a value, store a snippet of text that I can retrieve later. And that essentially becomes a bookmark service. So being able to do things like that to just kind of improve little workflows, little sort of things that nag you in your day-to-day work that are not necessarily programming related or ops related, those kinds of things are really useful. At the last company I worked at, we used a plugin that I developed called Lita Retro, which was used to facilitate retrospective meetings for the team. So we would have retros once a week, and it would just be to discuss whatever's been going on with the team, things that went well, things that aren't working so well that you want to try to improve, and we would use Lita to essentially record thoughts that we had during the week about things that we wanted to discuss at the next meeting, and that way you didn't have to keep that in your head and try to remember it for the next time. And then when the meeting actually comes, we just ask Lita for the list of retro topics, and it spits them all out, and we just go through them one by one.
That's awesome.
So this was a really useful way of just kind of improving the process of the team without a particularly technical sort of reasoning.
Yeah, I think Hubot does kind of have, at least for people getting started, it's like there's all these like funny things. There's like the Ship It Squirrel and Pug Bombs, and it's like, well, how is this doing something useful? But I think those are jokes at GitHub, and I think it's important to kind of build those into your own culture, or like whenever you're using a spot, it's like doing something that's useful, doing something that's funny. Like, I think the most recent script I was just looking at is a Santa hat. Puts Santa hat on your avatar, very important. But yeah, just like seeing people like adding scripts for different things, like it's always nice. I gave a talk at like Rocky Mountain Ruby a few years ago, and like I said, chatops is like part chat, but ops is just more doing things, not necessarily like operations. It's like operations of anything, really.
Yeah, that might be a slight downside to the naming of that term, is that it implies that it's very technical when it doesn't have to be by any stretch of the imagination.
Well, very cool. Okay, so we're going to wrap it up because we're getting right at an hour and people have got to get back to work and all that joy. I'm sitting up at a camp right now, so I'm going to go back to hanging out with high school students.
Cool.
So before we get going, are there anything you guys wanted to mention? for our wonderful viewers out there?
Well, just that if you want to learn more about this topic, I would recommend following the chatops subreddit. So if you go to reddit/r/chatops, there's various links and discussions that appear there. That's a good place to ask questions that are kind of about this topic without being specific to a particular chatbot. Lita also has its own, if you want Lita-specific stuff, you can send mail to the Lita mailing list, which is on Google Groups. And there's also a public IRC channel on Freenode that's lita.io. So you can come in there and chat with us and talk about your use cases and any issues that you're having, learning about how to use it.
Nice.
And of course, you can also send me a message on Twitter. I'm Jimmy Quadro on Twitter, and there's also a Twitter account for Lita that you can follow as well for updates and questions.
Awesome. Anything from you, Josh?
Not really.
Works for me.
Yeah, we're TechFocus on Twitter. Hubot. I'm happy to follow along on any tweets about Hubot, so I usually chime in if I see them. And it's IRC channel is Hubot on Freenode.
Cool. All right. Just want to finish up. Don't forget AWS Advent is going on. I want to say it's awsadvent.tumblr. Is that okay? So AWS Advent on Tumblr, and sysadvent is going on for its 7th year. Holy crap! And it's just sysadvent.com. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks very much for having me.
You're muted, Brandon.